Thank you to everyone for attending the webinar tonight. My name is Monique Ryan and I am standing as the independent candidate for the electorate of Kooyong in the forthcoming federal election. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation. Firstly, let me pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging in the land in which I'm sitting and the land that each of us are sitting in, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded to us. Firstly, I have the pleasure and the privilege of being here this evening with Saul Griffith, who is an inventor and a scientist and recent author of a book that I really, really enjoy, which was written for the Australian context and which is called The Big Switch. Saul is an engineer and he's founder of Rewiring America and more recently Rewiring Australia. Here's some we prepared earlier. There's a non-profit organisations and working towards a future in which we electrify in everything. Saul has been a project lead on US federally funded research projects for agencies including NASA, the National Science Foundation and the United States Special Operations Command. And his work includes mapping huge quantities of data and presenting it in a way which is easy to understand to show energy supply and demand in areas across the country. That book, The Big Switch, which we'll speak of a lot tonight, looks at Australian energy flows and presents some really exciting blueprints for how we can decarbonise our own society, improve our health and save money. We can take advantage of our enormous natural gifts of resources of wind and solar with a low population density and position ourselves as an extremely prosperous but entirely renewable economy. So what I'm going to do tonight is just start with a few questions for Saul, and then he's going to give us a bit of a presentation. There is an opportunity for people to raise questions from the audience, and please just put them in the Q&A at the bottom and we'll get to them as best we can over the course of the evening. I'll be the one asking Saul the actual questions, but I will be responding to the questions as they come through. So why am I asking the questions? I decided to stand in this federal election because I feel really passionate about climate change, but I'm not an expert on it, as most of us are not. People very often raise questions about our response to climate change, which are really important to them, but I find that many people are in different positions in terms of the complexity and the maturity of what we can do going forward. So I'm just going to start off with a bit of context setting for Saul. So just a few questions to kick the discussion off. So Saul, this week we've had the third part of the most recent IPCC report, which says that we're almost past the point where we can arrest global warming at the 1.5 degree mark. Can you tell us what you think about the issue of climate change as a force for driving change in Australia?
Well, my child was sent home from school early today and won't be going to school tomorrow because of unseasonal flooding, which is to say that I'm now one of, I think, the majority of Australians who've either experienced droughts or flooding or fires that should concern us, that are caused by climate change. I would love us to act upon the climate imperative to meet our demand and just on that moral imperative. But I actually think the good news, or the news that is about to be good, is that it's also an economic imperative. Like, Australians are going to save a huge amount of money in their households and in their communities when we decarbonize, and it's an unprecedented opportunity for economic renewal in our suburbs as well as economic renewal in our regions, and for changing the balance of our exports in a way. We really are the luckiest country and could be a renewable superpower, exporting green metals to the world and making much more money than we make in the current fossil focused export economy. I actually have a couple of slides that I made after I read the IPCC report this week to emphasize that point. I could show them now or a little later if you want to, if you'd really like to see that IPCC context for what we have to do in our communities, I could show you those.
Okay, let's do that. Let's go with that straight off.
I know that means we're going a little out of script, but you know,
that's okay.
You're about to go into Australian politics, so you're off script on day one, I imagine.
Yep. Let's let it rip.
I actually read the IPCC reports. This one was 3,000 pages. Fortunately, it was shorter than the last one, which was close to 4,000. And it's worth looking at. This is what are called the emissions trajectories that we need to stay on in order to keep our climate at as close as we can to 1.5 degrees. Here's 40 gigatons here. That's the annual global emissions of carbon dioxide. 0 is where we need to get to. All of these curves now go below 0, meaning later this century needs some negative emissions in order to balance the books. This gray scenario has huge amounts of negative emissions, and as actually does P3. The scenarios are called P1, P2, P3, P4. Australia was complicit in lobbying to put these huge amounts of negative emissions there in the 2000s. These are now unreasonable amounts. Just to put it in perspective, this number here, -10, that's 10 billion tons a year of CO2 that we have to be burying per year later this century to hit those targets. That can't really happen. Why? 10 gigatons is the amount of fossil fuels we pull out of the ground every year. All of the coal, all of the natural gas, all of the oil. So we're literally imagining building an industry as big or twice as big as all fossil fuel industries in the world in the next 30 years to bury a waste product. You'd need 15% of the world's energy and 7% of the world's agricultural land to do it. It's not going to happen. So what we really need to do is fast and early emission reductions and stay on these P1, P2 pathways. Now, if you look, I can use that to contextualize your community. So this is the first 3/4 of our emissions, the first 75%. You can honestly say these are the 75% emissions we know how to fix today. Electrifying our vehicles, electrifying our heating systems, running it all off solar, wind, hydroelectricity, nuclear, perhaps in Japan and Northern Europe. The last 25% are the things we don't yet have solutions for. So those are things like agricultural emissions, cement, steel making. So we need to buy ourselves time to invent those technologies by overperforming on the things we know how to do in the next 20 years. And that realistically looks like this curve on the right here. Your community needs to be riding a trajectory of emissions reductions that looks like this, cutting by more than half by 2030, getting close to 0 by 2040. To really emphasize it, I think that when you say that, that gets a little bit scary. Here's the challenge. When I think about emissions, I actually think about machines. That's really what I've studied, is how all of these emissions relate to the real world. In the real world, everyone you're from Victoria, most of you have a water heater. Most of your water heaters are running on gas. Most of you have kitchen stoves that are running on gas, space heaters that are running on gas, and cars that are running on petrol. You're going to replace all of those in the next 20 years anyway, because cars only live 20 years, water heaters only last 10 years. What we need to do as a nation is make sure that every citizen, the next time their water heater fails, gets an electric heat pump one and is powering it from solar and wind. The next time someone's buying a kitchen appliance, can't be gas, has to be electric. We need what they call 100% adoption rate. Basically, as soon as possible, everyone who's ever making one of these purchasing decisions needs to make it all electric. And we need to have plans like this. I thought this was a lovely way of expressing it. A year ago, my family pledged a net zero 2025 plan. This came from somebody who watched one of my talks, and they said, we're going to get solar this year. I kind of love the idea. They're planning out then over the next 2 years buy the stove and the water heater electric, because they're waiting for the prices of batteries to drop, and they will drop significantly by 2024. And then in 2025, they'll get an electric car, and then nearly all of their emissions are gone. And then they'll focus on the remainder, which are things like banking and their eating habits. But you can sort of now imagine every household makes a little plan like this. That's all of our collective plans. And that's actually how we hit our targets. And what we need to be thinking about in a policy sense is how do we make it possible, affordable, for every household to get on that plan. That's the easiest way to contextualize the IPCC report in terms of what you have to do in your kitchen, in your garage, in your basement, on your roof.
All right. Well, then what I might get you to do is...
Sorry, did I go way off script?
No, that's a great start. That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to get you now, ask you now, if you can, to take us back and say, well, you know, you were just pointing out the fact that we need to get this thing kickstarted and we need to do it in the next 5 to 10 years because we're only, 7 budgets away from 2030. But we've just had an Australian budget in which spending on climate change mitigation was actually cut rather than increased. Can I ask you to take us back to the start in a way in terms of what we need to do to kickstart this process and how you see we're working in the sort of things that we've been talking about with your book and the Big Switch?
Again, I'm going to go cut to some slides. So for context, there was $11.6 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies in this year's budget, the majority of which are fuel excise credits, about $8 or $9 billion worth. We could instead be spending that money much better, and I'm about to tell you how we should be spending that type of budget, and hopefully I'll get you to where we want to go. So here again, I'm going to share my screen. I think this is an important slide to start with for the Australian context because of where the climate debate is. I've redrawn, these are all of Australia's emissions of CO2, but I've redrawn them around 3 things. The emissions that don't go on technically don't get counted on our budget from exporting all of our fossil fuels, the emissions that are caused by our domestic economy producing all of those fossil fuels and exports, and then the emissions in our domestic economy. I put green colors next to things that we know how to do today and we have technologies to fix, orange against things that are not yet working. So green things are electrifying everything in your household and using using solar and wind to do it. Orange are things like, how are we going to decarbonize cement? How are we going to decarbonize agriculture? How are we going to decarbonize steel making? We don't know how to do those yet. The red emissions are where we've traditionally had the fight in Australian politics over climate. These are the exports that we're living in fear of losing, right? So the only way to eliminate those emissions is to stop exporting fossil fuels, but we're not going to have the social license to do that unless we come up with a better idea for what replaces those exports. That we can do later this, that's really a project for the 2030s when we will produce so much renewables that we can supply the world with green metals. But let's focus tonight on what we need, what we can do right away for those early emissions, because they're so critical, and that's our domestic economy and our households. 42% of our emissions come from decisions we make around the kitchen table. These are when you decide what car you're going to buy, what's the heating source for your home, where does the electricity come from, and how are your fuels made. This is what the Australian household does today. We purchase electricity, most of it comes from coal, natural gas for all of these, our hot tubs and our water heaters and our kitchens, and petrol for our vehicles. This is New South Wales here. Most of our electricity comes from black coal. In Victoria, it's even worse up in the top right-hand corner there, brown coal, the worst, most polluting of all. So what do we have to do to get to zero emissions? We got to electrify all of the demand side machines, and we have to supply it with clean electricity. It's actually a remarkably simple recipe. You should think about, in the 20th century, we thought about infrastructure as snowy projects and roads and dams and transmission lines. But in the 21st century, the infrastructure literally goes all the way to your household. The majority of our emissions come from the machines inside our house. We need to start thinking about them as national infrastructure in a finance sense and in an emission sense. That's the 1.8 vehicles that need to be electrified in every driveway. That's the electrification of our water heating systems, electrification of our space heating systems, of our kitchens, providing as much of that with community and rooftop solar as we can, and having batteries and upgraded main panels to support that electrification. Then, of course, for the remainder of the electricity that we will need, and we will need more than we can generate in our communities, we need to connect via transmission to the big renewable sources, which are solar, wind, and hydro. The reason to emphasize electrification is actually because the machines are superior and they're going to save us huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of money. Just, in a cartoon way, this is the nice reality of the electric machines that are coming. When you get the electric Ford Ranger that'll be arriving in Australia probably in 2024, it'll use less than 1/3 of the energy of the Ford Ranger that you're currently running on petrol. When you electrify your water heater, it'll use only 1/3 of the energy of your natural gas. That's because of the miracle that is the electric heat pump. The electric heat pump you might know as a mini split if you've got one of those in your house. It's also the technology that makes your refrigerator work. That heat pump can also be applied to our space heat. So we need to replace the natural gas that's heating Victorian homes, for example, with electric space heaters. That again will save 2/3 of the energy that's being wasted today. Electrifying your cooking similarly will lower by half the amount of energy required to boil your cup of tea and cook your dinner. And the biggest saving, of course, of all is the enormous amount of waste energy in the way we generate electricity today. So in Victoria, it's mostly brown coal making your electricity. Less than 25% of the energy in that coal winds up as electricity delivered to you. The rest goes up the smokestack as waste heat. Same with natural gas. When we do it with wind and renewables, all of that energy will be saved. It means the following remarkable thing. Average Australian household uses 100 kilowatt hours of all energy sources today. Yet when we go to all electric, those machines are so efficient, you'll need about 1/3 of that, 37 kilowatt hours per day. Same sized houses, same bad insulation, which is the Australian tradition in building our buildings, same giant oversized cars that we all owned. We can in fact keep that Australian dream and do it with about 1/3 of the energy by electrifying everything. The exciting thing about those efficiencies, it leads to really good economics. And, to give you a cartoon of what is the economics of this transition, average Australian household today, you're representing Kooyong, so you're probably all a little bit above this average, but this is, I think, what we need to get to. The average Australian household is spending $80,000 a year after they pay their taxes, little more than $5,000 a year on energy, $2,500 to $3,000 on petrol and diesel, $1,700 or $1,800 on electricity, $700 on gas. In Victoria, it's even more on gas. That is about 4% of spending, 5% of spending for the top 20% income households on the right there, but the lowest 20% income households, it's 8 to 10% of their spending, and very significant. The amazing thing that is happening, though, is the huge fall in costs of solar, wind, and batteries. These are known as learning curves. It's the reason why 20 years ago, solar was too expensive for any household, and it's the reason why solar today is the cheapest electricity. Australian rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity in the world, because every time we doubled the amount of solar that we were producing, the cost fell by 20%. Same is happening for batteries. They're falling by 20% every time we double capacity. Wind, 14%. To solve climate change, we're going to need to double the amount of solar 3 to 4 more times, double the amount of wind 3 to 4 more times, double the amount of batteries 3 to 4 more times. This is what's driving the cost coming down, and the costs will fall by more than half over the next decade. That's what drives this phenomenon, which I think is what you were excited to get to. This is what is the opportunity for the Australian household. On that left column, that is the cost of energy for petrol, diesel, gas, and electricity for the average Australian household in 2021. This year, because of, we calculated that with petrol at $1.48, at $1.90. Thanks to the Ukraine situation, it's now $7,000 a year for the average Australian household. Many of you may have bought a Tesla and a solar system and some of these things, and you'll know that if you can afford the upfront cost, it saves you money, and that's that little pink bar at the bottom. That's how much the energy cost goes down. But you need to finance these expensive machines up front. But the good news is the Teslas are getting cheaper every year. There's more and more variety. There are Hyundais coming. There are Toyotas coming that are electric. and we're coming down this cost curve, we now can see the point in the future. It's 2024, 2025, that the financed cost of these electric machines for the Australian household, including batteries and including their solar, will be lower than their cost of energy is today. In a few households, in a few postcodes, it's already economic, but it's actually going to be broadly economic for every household in 2024, 2025. By 2030, we'll be saving $3,000 to $5,000 per household per year. That's about $40 billion a year in savings across the economy. That is more than we make in profit on our fossil fuel exports. So that is extremely economically significant for the country. The point and the reason I brought up the $11 billion that we just gave in fossil fuel subsidies in the budget, if you imagine that we were trying to get to zero emissions by 2032, that means you need to do 10% of households every year between now and 2032. For an investment of about $12 billion, we would get every Australian household past this threshold and into the saving money. So for the amount of money that we have budgeted for 1 year's worth of fossil fuel subsidies under the current treasurer, we could have been subsidizing every one of Australia's 10 million households to be purchasing the upgrades to their household infrastructure that will be saving them money year over year into the future. Even if the economic models here are off by a factor of 2, it merely means that we need 2 years of Australia's fossil fuel subsidies to decarbonize 100% of our household emissions. Maybe if you want me to go further, to reduce it to like daily economics, it's at $1.40 a litre, it's $12 per 100 kilometres to drive your car. So that's probably $16 per 100 kilometres now. If you were charging your electric vehicle, same size vehicle, off rooftop solar today, it's about $4 a 100 kilometres. This is what we have to do in terms of everyday things. For a natural gas water heater in Melbourne, for an 8-minute luxurious shower, 66 cents. If you were doing that using solar and heat pump, it's about 20 cents. So we could be putting these everyday savings into every Australian household experience, but we need a proactive electrification policy as at the core and the center of our climate policy.
I might kick off this discussion though, if I can, Saul. There's a few questions coming through, but I've also got a couple for you. The first I'm going to start with, just because I get asked this every single day in the street, and I know what I say, but I'd love to hear how you put your answer, which is, but what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? How are we going to ensure that the supply of electricity 24/7 around Australia is going to be adequate for surges and for times where there's dips and ebbs in production from renewables?
Part of the answer is it's always sunny somewhere. We've just had what feels like 3 months of constant rain in Wollongong. And so instead of staying here for the school holidays, we're now going to go to Adelaide because it's always sunny in Adelaide. And while that's a bit of a flippant joke, people who study renewable energy generation now know that if the wind is not blowing at one wind turbine, if you have 100 wind turbines in one location, they can all be not running. But if every one of those wind turbines is separated by 50 kilometers, they statistically are producing a huge amount of energy. So that geographic distribution and connecting all of our generators together over the national electricity network is critical to making it work, because it makes it much, much more reliable. So that's part of the answer, is connecting more and more to the national grid. In fact, there would be an enormous advantage to connecting our national. We are not connected to Western Australia right now. It's 3 time zones away. It would be huge. The biggest energy load of the day happens around 6 or 7 p.m. when everyone gets home. Unfortunately, usually that's when the sun's starting to go down. If we were connected to the West Australian grid, we could be using their late afternoon sunshine to power our evening meals. We should be thinking about the nation like that. Another part of the answer might be a little bit unexpected. The history of the renewable energy world comes from that efficiency mindset of the 1970s. And we've struggle to think about how do we get to 100% renewable. The reality is now that these energy sources are so cheap that we can think about having more than 100%. When you think about, I sell wholesale electricity to the California electricity grid through a company I started in California, and we sell that electricity at about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Adding 50% more capacity than I need makes that 3 cents a kilowatt hour. The average transmission and distribution cost to get electricity from the grid to your house is 17 cents. So the fraction of the generation cost is tiny. What I'm trying to say is Australia is so well endowed with renewables, and these renewable energy sources are now so cheap that we only need about 20% oversupply to guarantee that even when there's on the cloudy or the rainy days, we have enough energy to always meet our needs. So there's really 3 parts to your question. The other is the enormous number of batteries that are about to be deployed. To put that in perspective, one of my American colleagues took receipt today of a Rivian electric truck. It's about the size of a Toyota Hilux or a Ford Ranger. So it's very much the Australian iconic ute, 4-wheel drive ute. It has a 180 kilowatt hour battery in it. Oh. That truck. It costs $73,000 American, so it's about $100,000 Australian, but it's a very luxurious truck. That battery could power every activity in the average Australian household today for about 12 days. And even if we electrify everything in the future, for 3 or 4 days. There's going to be 20 million of those vehicles connected to the grid. There will be a little battery on the side of every house. We've got to imagine we are literally going to be in this world of energy abundance is the much more likely scenario. And we need to stop the scare campaign that has successfully prevented us from going here, which has been the lingua franca of Australian politics. It's about what we have to lose, right? It's not about what we have to lose. We are going to win. Energy is going to be cheaper than you ever had it. These electric trucks will have more torque. The electric jet ski that you have, you'll be able to, slide it by your wife under the excuse of it's a resiliency plan for the house. The electric jet ski is the battery backup for 2 weeks, right? But quite literally, Australia will solve this fear of what happens, when the wind isn't blowing somewhere through abundance.
And how do we build the grid? Like how much work is that going to take? How much time will that take? Is it going to be a private venture, or is it purely a nationalized grid? How does that work?
If you look at most communities in Australia, except for the highest density ones, the majority of the extra electricity we need, so we need about 250 or 300% of the electricity we use today. The majority of that can come from rooftop solar and community solar in your community. Because it is on your roof or in your community, it doesn't need to travel thousands of kilometers, and it doesn't need to have this expensive grid and transmission cost on top. So the cheapest solution will be to do as much of it as possible within your local community. And that's not only solar on your roof, but it's solar on the bowling club, and it's solar on the RSL, and it's solar on the surf club, and solar at the church, and solar at the school. Batteries in those locations also will help balance the local grid. So a surprising amount of this is likely to roll out without requiring substantial new transmission or distribution infrastructure, because actually the wires in your local community in Kooyong can already carry probably 10 times the electricity they currently do, because they're designed for the peak load, not the average load. So there's plenty of, they call it bandwidth, there's headroom to grow all of that. We will need some new transmission and some new distribution, and that will be done at the federal level, and that'll be interstate transmissions. That needs to be, and it traditionally has been, public-private partnerships. And we need to do those projects sensibly, and we'll need a little more cooperation between the states than we saw during COVID. But I don't lose any sleep about our capacity. in many respects, that's the easiest problem.
There's a question that's come in about batteries and production of batteries and whether our capacity to expand that is going to be sufficient for what we're going to need.
Like I said, the world needs to be producing 10 to 20 times as many batteries as it does today. 5 years ago, people wrung their hands about it in scientific circles. Well, where are we going to get the lithium? Is there enough? We have unearthed substantial new deposits in Australia and in North America in the last 5 years. That has made everyone far less concerned. There is enough of it. Will we scale it up fast enough? That's a question of government policy as much as it is of technology. If the governments of the world had very aggressive electric vehicle strategies, then more businesses would be more confidently investing in getting those resources.
What about people who have concerns? How would you respond to people who have concerns about leaving people who are less well off behind in terms of this transition, given the costs that are inherent in putting in the solar and putting in the batteries and things like that and electrifying the homes?
So I'm confident that we will realize those savings because, the Ford F-150, which is the most produced ute in the history of the world, is being delivered in America this year. It's a $40,000 truck with a 100 kilowatt hour battery. That is a battery that costs less than a third of the batteries that we're putting on the side of our homes right now, and it comes with a free truck. So that speaks to the economics are going to get there. So then it's actually going to be who can access this. For honestly, the top 10 or 20% of homes, so they're the homes that can afford a Range Rover or a Volvo or some luxury imported car, they could afford it today, and just by choosing a Hyundai Kona instead of a Range Rover, they'd be releasing enough money, household spending, to buy all the other toys they need. For the next 40, 50, 60% of the electorate that have a mortgage, we have fantastic mechanisms to tie these purchasing decisions to those mortgages and be paying it off at low long-term interest rates the same way we do. And the prices will come down a little, and those households will finance it that way. And I think there's plenty of room for business model innovation there. But then you end up with the lowest income 20 to 40% of households you should still be concerned about. Absolutely. And you already see advertising campaigns from the natural gas companies in Victoria that are trying to drive a wedge on this cost issue. They're using deceiving economics and deceiving advertisements to say, oh, if the only cheap way if you're low income to afford to heat your house is natural gas. So we need to invent as many mechanisms, rebates, subsidies as possible to figure out how to bring every household along, because if we don't bring every household along, a cultural wedge is going to be driven here about who can afford this and who can't, and it will be a much, much worse version of, I just drove a Tesla 6,000 kilometers across Australia, and in country towns you can feel the resentment. Of
the electric vehicle.
I think the Tesla, because it's a little virtue signaling latte sipping. I think the electric trucks will solve that problem, and they're on their way. And they'll just be too fast and too fun to deny. But I think there is this is a rich person's solution challenge that we are facing. And we just have to fight that back with good policy, right? Australia has had very liberal economic policy around helping Australians afford homes for, ever since World War II. That's part of the Australian dream. It's being eroded a little, but if we were sensible, we'd be figuring out how to use that type of public policy and fiscal policy mechanism to help every household afford this. In public housing, we'd be finding ways to subsidize it. That's already happening in South Australia and Victoria, for example, the ACT. I think this issue is hugely important. There needs to be a lot of answers, like how are we going to pass these savings on through to renters? That's going to be a combination of local and state regulations that either enable that or not. I think it absolutely should be the core focus of a political party that wants to get elected and stay elected, to figure out how to pass those savings on, particularly to the households that need it most, which are those that are struggling economically.
This is an interesting question from anonymous attendee who's asked, with the increasing efficacy of the smart grid, is baseload power an outdated idea?
Baseload power is an outdated idea. The idea being, if you can intelligently, your water heater effectively is a battery. In fact, everyone probably remembers the Solar Heart advertisements from the 1980s, when you could buy off-peak electricity, which basically means buy the coal at night when the coal couldn't turn itself off quickly enough, because coal-fired generators have too much inertia. So you could charge it up at night. Now you just need to charge it up during the day, because now the cheapest electricity is when the sunshine. We need to we need to be charging the vehicles through the day. The biggest electric load on our grid in the future is going to be our electric vehicles and our aluminum smelters. So figuring out how to align those big loads, water heaters, vehicles, aluminum smelters, and turn them on and off so you can charge them at the right times is really what that smart grid enables. And we can turn enough of those things on and off that, in combination with the hydroelectric resources of Australia is enough to balance the wind and the solar.
I'm going to ask this question. I know what you're going to say, but it's been asked by a couple of different people. Nuclear. What do you think about nuclear? Can we meet the challenge without going nuclear at some stage?
Australia is the 7th largest landmass in the world and has the lowest population density of any country except for Kazakhstan and some other country. Because of that, we could power all of Australia on less than 1/4% of the landmass being covered with solar and wind. That's less than the amount of landmass we've covered with roads and parking lots. In North America, you need about 1 to 2% of the landmass to be covered in wind and solar to power an all-electric, thriving America. It too can probably run on wind and solar and hydroelectricity alone, maybe some geothermal, but it would be easier in the US if it also did some nuclear. It is already doing some nuclear, and in fact 20% of the electricity in the US today is generated by nuclear. Nuclear can't solve all the problem, because in fact the US could probably only double that before they run out of cooling water, because you have to cool the nuclear power plant with water. All of that water then gets flushed back into rivers at high temperature. And so probably the upper limit on nuclear in the US is 20-ish% of electricity. In China, you'd have to cover 10% of the country, China and India, to supply the whole country with that modern lifestyle using wind and solar alone. So there are countries in the world, Northern Europe, China, India, where it's very hard to imagine solving this without some amount of nuclear. Nuclear is not the unique panacea that people think it is. It's hard to site, it's expensive, it takes a long time. In the US, they've only installed 1 new power plant in the last 40 years. It's expensive relative to solar and wind. So on balance, I'm not anti-nuclear, I'm not pro-nuclear. I'm pragmatically where you need it nuclear. You don't need it in Australia. I don't see us installing it and getting approved on a timeline relevant to the emission reductions we need to do. Could we put 1 or 2 traditional 1 gigawatt reactors in the middle of South Australia or Western Australia or Western New South Wales and make it all easier to balance? It would make it marginally easier. Yes, you could do that. Do I think we'll get the political will and we won't run into the NIMBY problems? No.
No, I think you're probably right, actually.
Yeah.
Great.
I think that one will even get Peter Garrett out of bed again.
Well, I know, and I'd be scared of Peter Garrett coming after me at this point in my life, although we're all moving more slowly than we used to. I'm just looking at, I've got two sets of questions here in two different chat lines. There's a few questions about the possibility of power lines going overseas and the just the practicalities of putting in a grid that extends as far as Western Australia in terms of the size of that project. But I know that we've discussed before the possibility of the pipeline to Singapore. How big are these projects for those of us who aren't really practically minded?
They're pretty easy projects. They're $1 billion. They're low risk if you're just connecting Western Australia to South Australia to Victoria. It's
$1 billion.
No, I haven't scoped the cost. It will be a few billions of dollars to connect Western Australia.
Just put it for me in terms of non-existent submarine, not submarine purchases. If we say that a non-existent submarine,
my God, you could decarbonize every Australian household for the price of one submarine. You could connect Western Australia to the rest of the NEM, the National Electricity System, for less than the price of one submarine. You can connect us to
an existent submarine or a non-existent submarine? Non-existent submarine.
The theoretical submarines. I have visited multiple nuclear power plants in my life in the US. I know a lot of nuclear power engineers. The majority of the nuclear fleet in the US is run by ex-Navy captains. The most reactors and where everyone gets their training is running nuclear powered submarines. You can't have a highly functioning, safe nuclear power sector without a highly functioning training ground that looks like nuclear powered submarines. So are we backing our way in weirdly to nuclear that way? Maybe. I still don't think we need it. But these big transmission projects, we also don't really need. I mean, Indonesia needs it more than we do, so we may make money from it. I think it's a very big, bold project. I'm glad I'm not running that project. That's got so many political hurdles. What
are we up to with that at this point? What's the progress? Do you know what the progress is on that to date?
It's all in planning and, trying to get approvals for the right of way through all the waterways that you need to get. I mean, the Norwegians have built underwater high voltage DC cables that go further than this already. This is not a risky high technology. This is all of the risk in that project is around the nervousness of Singapore and having a sole source of energy coming from Australia on one pipeline. Will Australia cut off Singapore in a fit of national security, something or other, right? That's what drives it. I think those projects are interesting, but the way that Australia is really going to export its cheap energy is in the form of metals, that processing our own ores into metals domestically like we used to. We only 99% of our iron ore is exported as iron ore. If we processed all of Australian iron ore into metal, and I say this as a metallurgist, my first job, in fact, was on the rod and bar mill in Newcastle in the steel industry. So I grew up making steel. If we converted all of our iron ore into steel in Australia, that would be worth $800 billion as an export industry. That is 10 times larger than our entire fossil fuel export industry today. And it's 10 times large, more than 10 times larger than our iron ore export business today. The majority of the cost of steel and aluminum is the cost of the energy that goes into making it, right? So the cheapest energy in the future is going to be Australian wind and solar because we have so much of it and it is so cheap. The idea that we're going to inefficiently to convert that into hydrogen and ship it to Korea with iron ore, and then in Korea they're going to use that energy and that hydrogen that will be 3 or 4 times the cost of our electric energy here in Australia. They won't be able to compete with us on making steel. So the long-term, very rosy good news story for Australia is we've got a small population. We can put more wind and solar in than we need. We can use it to make the metals that the world needs for this transition. And we are the first, second, third, or fourth provider of all of the metals of note that we need. That is steel, because the wind turbines and the solar still need a bunch of steel. It's aluminum, it's copper, it's lithium, it's cobalt, it's nickel, it's uranium. Australia has all of these in spades, and just by spending some of our energy processing it into metal instead of just shipping the crushed rocks, Australia could have an export economy 10 times more vibrant than the one we have today, far, far more profitable than the industries that export industries we have today. That's what we have to win this decade, is really good economics for our households as we electrify our communities, really good economics for our communities, because a lot of that job generation will be in communities. For every 1,000 households, you're going to create about a dozen jobs for tradies, and the household savings are going to create another 50 jobs in the community. So think of that, for 60 new jobs created for every 1,000 households we electrify. That's what we can win economically this decade. Next decade, by making the right investments in getting back into exporting these green metals, that's, we have to win a much more profitable, much bigger export industry.
So you said another 50 jobs that were going to be about somewhere between 6 and 10 jobs or so for in the electrification process, and then another 50 jobs generated from the household savings. How does that work? What sort of jobs are they exactly? Because there is a question here about how many people we're going to need to manifest this sort of all electric future.
Well, maybe we should talk about one of Australia's success stories as a good example. When I have a weekly call with the White House where we advise the White House on electrification strategy as part of my work at Rewiring America. And when I refer to the Australian rooftop solar experience, it's known as the Australian rooftop miracle. So rooftop solar installs here at $1 a watt, and that's why it costs us 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour after financing. In the US, it installs at $3.20 a watt. And in fact, we pay our solar installers more than America pays its solar installers. So what's the difference? We ran a certification and training program in Australia that trained the workforce and also certified them to do such a good job, because we have highly trained workforce, that they carry less liability than the American solar contractors. And so they don't have to build in huge high margins. They are also doing such quality jobs that we've lowered the burden on the inspection and the permitting processes. And so we've eliminated a lot of those soft costs. Because those two things made it cheaper, and cheaper than the grid, then you can save money on the cost of selling it to the customer. So it costs 70 cents to sell solar to a US customer because it's more expensive than the grid. In Australia, it costs you 1 cent because your neighbor got it and his energy bills went down, and he says to you, you should get it too, mate. So we need to do that same thing for the other 6 things we need to install. So we need similar workforce training, capacity building, and elimination of the green and red tape for putting in our heat pumps for our hot water systems, for doing it for our building heating systems, for the electric vehicle charging systems we have to put in, for all the batteries we have to put in our houses, and even for the electrification of our kitchens. And so the first dozen jobs created in every community of 1,000 homes that are going to be kind of permanently forever jobs are going to be in the community tradie jobs that are installing and maintaining all of that new household infrastructure. The money saved by the households, in traditional economic theory, you can estimate the other jobs that are created, not the direct jobs, but the indirect jobs, from the amount of money saved, because then people, a household that saves $3,000 a year is more likely to spend a lot of that in their community buying groceries and coffees and omelets and fancy dinners. And in fact, just using classic economic theory, those household savings will create another 50 jobs in that community of 1,000 households. That is very significant, because there's probably only 1,200 working adults in that community of 1,000 households, and now you're creating 60 new jobs. It is a very significant generator of jobs. The other jobs, what type are they? They're all through the economy, right? So it's the jobs of the school teachers, it's the jobs of the bakers and the coffee makers, and it's the jobs of the manufacturers and all the other things. So they're in the bucket of the indirect jobs. And then the 12 jobs will be, recognizable tradie jobs driving white trucks, except that white trucks will now be electric.
Okay, great. I'm gonna use a rude word here, Saul. So it's a word I don't think you like very much, but people would like to know why it is hydrogen. So in your book,
For fuck's sake.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I know I warned you. It's a terribly rude word. What some people love the hydrogen and embraced hydrogen and the promise of hydrogen, but in your book you're saying that you feel it could be a problem as well as a potential solution. We do know that people like Twiggy Forrest are putting a huge amount of money into investment in hydrogen.
Really? Or is he asking for a handout? I think it's the latter, not the former.
Okay.
So let's talk about hydrogen for a minute. I love talking about hydrogen. If hydrogen wins, I stand to make more money than Twiggy. So you may not know it, but I started a hydrogen energy storage company many, many years ago to make hydrogen tanks for all of the world's vehicle manufacturers. So I sold that technology. We made the best, cheapest, strongest hydrogen tanks. I've been out in the desert. I've shot giant bullets at hydrogen tanks to see how they explode and fail. And so I know quite a lot about hydrogen, including its dangers. And we sold that company to a consortium that included Toyota and Porsche and Chrysler and Audi and VW. I'm not coming at hydrogen from a position of ignorance. The hydrogen is only a small number of things that we absolutely need it for. In fact, there's only one thing that we absolutely need it for, which is making ammonia, which is used, 1% of the world's energy is used to make ammonia for fertilizer. So we need hydrogen for that. And so that's about 1% of the world's energy flow. Hydrogen has lost the battle for the world's vehicles. Batteries are just cheaper and faster. Why is that? Imagine I have 1 unit of solar energy. If I put that into a battery and then I use that battery to drive an electric motor in a car, about 80% of that unit of solar energy drives the car. If I have the same 1 unit of solar energy and I electrolyze it to make hydrogen, I lose 25 or 30% of the energy in the electrolyzing. I then have to compress the hydrogen so I can store it on board, and I lose another 15% of the energy. And then I'm going to lose another 50% of the energy if I burn it in an internal combustion engine, or I'm going to lose it in a fuel cell. Either way, of that 1 unit of solar energy, I only get about 30% moving my car. So inherently, that hydrogen thing is going to be 2.5 times more expensive than the all electric solution, because it's still expensive to build a hydrogen tank and all the other pieces of the hydrogen. So it's not going to work for vehicles. There's a similar efficiency argument against using hydrogen for heating, against, hydrogen is not an energy source, it's an energy storage system. And as a battery, it's terrible. It's less than 50% efficient. So it's not really good for driving vehicles. It's not really good for flying airplanes. It's not really good for storage for the grid. It's not really good for high temperature heat. It might be useful for steel making, but again, only 1% of the world's energy is used for steel making. So, it's down to a tiny few percent of the things that it could do, and it's going to be expensive for those things relative to just doing the things all electrically. So I don't think Australia should have no hydrogen policy. I do believe there are niches where hydrogen will be okay. But I think because hydrogen rhymes to the gas industry, who stands, all of the world's hydrogen that we use today is a byproduct of the natural gas industry. So the natural gas industry basically is, when they see these hydrogen projects, are getting subsidies for doing what they're already doing, which is known as blue or gray or dark or horrible hydrogen, and pretending like hydrogen is going to be a real thing in the future. But the physics doesn't support it. The chemistry doesn't support it. It's dangerous. The third time hydrogen kills you, you burn to death. The first time your lungs collapse because of the pressure wave when it's released. The second time you suffocate. And then the third time you die, it's because you're burning in an invisible fire. It's not even a particularly safe way to do anything. So I think Australia needs to wisen up, stop allowing the distraction of hydrogen from being an excuse for climate policy and work on what works today. And to, maybe this is getting too political and I shouldn't say this, but I was in Tasmania 2 weeks ago. 2 days before I got there, Twiggy was there. Why was he there? Because Tasmania had announced the 200% renewable energy target, meaning in his mind, he could show up and get 100% of that renewable energy to make hydrogen. The trick was he requested that he got the lowest cost half of the 200%. And so he wanted to buy at $20 a megawatt hour all of the Tasmanian hydro that's already been built and is already producing at very low cost. By doing so, and so, the Tasmanian government might make the terrible decision to let him do this. God knows who's going to buy his hydrogen. But in doing so, he will drive up the cost of electricity for everyday Tasmanians because they should be using that 200% to electrify their vehicles and save money for them. So there's no one representing the Australian household in our climate policy debate. And in absence of that, our oligarchs, and I'm going to use that word carefully, are showing up and using it for subsidies for their extractive businesses. And it's not a good trade. It's not the way to eliminate the most emissions fast enough. It's not a good way to stimulate the Australian economy fast enough. And it really is tantamount to stealing money from the Australian public. Sorry, did that go too far?
No, I was just wondering if you'd like to tell us what you really feel. No, that was good. That's good.
Have some slides too. You want some graphs of how bad the thermodynamics are? I'm more than happy.
Well, no, I know that those things about the hydrogen are in your book, but someone did ask a question about, and I'm just lost. I'm trying to scroll back to it, about the place of hydrogens for heavy machinery. And I think it was big trucks.
The idea that when you call it heavy machinery, the idea is it's not weight sensitive, and so the argument for users hydrogen in vehicles is it's higher power density than batteries. But the people who say that, they are also disingenuous. The reason people like hydrogen is it's super high power density, 123 megajoules per kilogram. That's true in the gaseous form. But once you've compressed it and put it in a tank so that it can actually be used, the tank by necessity has to weigh 12, even if we make it out of the strongest stuff known to mankind, weighs 12 times as much as the hydrogen within the tank. So the energy density of hydrogen is actually about 10 megajoules a kilogram, which means it's 1/4 of the energy density of diesel. So it's not a great option.
No.
And because those vehicles aren't weight sensitive, the weight of the batteries won't really matter. So some of them will go electric and some of them will go biodiesel, and very few of them will go hydrogen.
Okay, good, excellent. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't really think we'd get that technical. I thought we were going to talk about the benefits of the Australian household, but I guess
we are. But people are asking these questions, and I think from looking at the chat, people are really enjoying your responses. We've only just got another 10 minutes or so, so I should comment that for everybody that Saul's still in the midst of COVID, so he's been extraordinarily generous and good with his time to be able to be here today, because he's supposed to be on Q&A, but is unwell, and we've been show us your rats. That's a bit personal. All right, in the next 10 minutes, so I'm just going to pose for you. We had a brief discussion about this the other day. In the perfect world, an Australian household, and I'm going to take an Australian suburb as well, I'm going to extend that to an Australian suburb, 10 years from now, what will it look like? If we did all the things that we could do, if we were smart and we were brave and we trusted ourselves, what would an Australian suburb and an Australian household look like in 10 years' time?
If I can do a little bit of storytelling, I think it's actually a nice way to get there. So I relocated to Austinmere, which is a suburb north of Wollongong, south of Sydney, last year with my family. So we moved here from the US. and my kids are going to Ostermere Public School, which is right on the beach in Ostermere. It's amazing. It's like one of these, typically spectacular public Australian facilities. How can the public school, in fact, have world-class surfing beach 100 feet from the classrooms? So it's beautiful. And my son was in the 6th grade, and he had to do a final assignment for the 6th grade. And the assignment was design a sustainable house. And my son, being a bit eccentric, was like, took the brief a little bit. Well, he didn't tell us that this was the main assignment for the semester until the night before. And the night before, he's like, oh, we have to do this thing. I have to build a model, but I don't want to build a sustainable house. I want to make the whole community sustainable. So, Dad, how many hydrogen balloons, in fact, do we need to float the entire suburb so that all of the people can float above the ground in this city, and all the animals can live below? That was his version of sustainability that I thought was great. So then we made a weird model of like 12 Hindenburgs floating the 1,500 households of Ostermere. The next day we go to school, and the other 59 kids are showing up with their parents carrying these architectural models of homes that looked like they had 50 parent hours of work in every single one of them. And I was proud of him, but I think he felt a little like, Dad, you should have worked harder on my model. But the astounding thing was, in a well-heeled suburb south of Sydney, 59 out of 60 families' version of the sustainable future looked like the house they're currently living in, with solar cells on the roof, an electric car in the garage, and a chicken coop. And that's what sustainability means, I think, in a suburb that I think that takes it seriously and wants to solve climate change. I found this distressing for a few days. I was hoping we were a little more ambitious, but I actually think, you know what, this is a long way of saying, what will your suburb look like in 2030 when we're zero emissions? It's kind of going to look like your current suburb, but it'll be electric vehicles in the garage, and there'll be chicken coops. The thing that's going to change the most is the chicken coops. Whether we like it or not, and this might be disappointing to die-hard environmentalists who are hoping this problem would be solved with public transport and, stainless steel cups. We can get to zero emissions with cars that look like our current cars, homes that look like our current homes. And so nothing will change enormously in your day-to-day life, except there'll be more solar cells on the roof, but by that point they'll blend in more. There'll be, I don't think anyone is going to miss going to the petrol station. It smells bad, doesn't feel good. So one of the things that'll change is you'll be plugging in your car while you're buying your groceries, and that'll be your week's worth of electricity for your car. There'll be solar cells over the car park at the school. All the teachers will charge there. Parents will plug in occasionally. Like, that's about as big as the differences need to be for us technically to fix. There's the seventh. They're the seventh grader who made that model. What? Hang on, Hako. I need this. So probably the thing that will change the most is that by virtue of this economic windfall, more families will have an electric jet ski. It could be good, is the point. We just honestly have to see past, like, we fought against climate change. The political battle here is about what we've had to lose, and they fought it on, we're going to lose our big export industries, and no one has dared to think, well, what do we have to win? Honestly, we have to win better air in our suburbs. The majority of asthmas in Australia are caused by breathing in the residues of fossil fuels, whether that's from the local coal plant or whether that's from the natural gas stove that's burning inside your house that's ruining your children's health. So, what else is going to change in the suburbs? We'll be healthier. The air quality will be better. There won't be as much road noise. You'll hear birds singing again because they won't be drowned out by everyone's V8. So I actually think there's an enormous amount of optimism that it's not going to change in ways, it's going to be change that's familiar enough, not uncomfortable. Actually, we're going to start to enjoy it. And, people will even start using electric barbecues, and they'll enjoy not eating, half a ton of carcinogens with every snack. It's going to be okay. We just need to have I think you said it beautifully. We just need to have the confidence that we can do it. And we can do it. Oh my God. And, the tradies want to do the work.
Okay, great. Well, I think that all sounds great. The only thing I object to is I really hate jet skis, but I'll give you jet skis if we can have the rest of it.
They're silent jet skis. They're electric.
Well, that's the problem. If you're a swimmer, you don't hear it. I'm a swimmer.
My father's theory of jet skis was jet skis should absolutely be illegal, but you shouldn't be allowed to start the motor until you're 1 kilometer offshore.
Well, I mean, as you know, you're not supposed to come in beyond the flags, but people do. And if they're silent, they'll be in some ways potentially even more dangerous. But yeah, we're
here to imagine the positive future. Electric donuts and electric utes. We've got to bring everyone along.
That's right. That's true. All right. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I cannot thank you enough for, it's above and beyond for spending this time with us all tonight when you've been unwell with the COVID and all. It's been really enjoyable, very informative, really grateful to you, and looking forward to working with you after the next federal election in making Australia a better country.
Hopefully we're a few short weeks from congratulations, and let's get to work on this project.
Okay, let's do it. Good. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your contribution tonight. It's been really fun. We'll see you all soon. Look after yourself. Get better. Bye now.